She had $31, 2 children, and a dead man's name that meant nothing out here. When Adeline Whitlock stepped off the supply wagon into Ash Ridge, Wyoming, the wind cut straight through her wool coat like it was paper, and every soul on that frozen main street stopped to stare, not with welcome, but with the particular coldness of people calculating how long before she became someone else's problem. She had heard about Gideon Hale. Everyone had. The rancher who buried his wife and his warmth in the same ground, who hadn't spoken a kind word to a living soul in 3 years. They told her not to bother. She knocked on his gate anyway. If this story moves something in you, hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. Tim. The wagon that brought her into town belonged to a feed merchant named Dolph Carver, who had picked her up outside of Laramie because she'd offered to mend harnesses and cook breakfast along the trail, and because her little girl had looked at him with eyes so tired and so patient that he hadn't had the heart to say no. Adeline had learned in the months since her husband's death that pride was a luxury she could not afford, so she mended the harnesses. She cooked the breakfast. She said thank you and meant it. Ash Ridge was not a welcoming town. It was the kind of place that had survived long enough to develop a hardness, a frontier settlement that had weathered enough failed farms and broken promises to grow suspicious of strangers, especially ones who arrived with nothing but children and determination. The main street was a single row of weathered buildings, a general store, a livery, a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, a saloon that no decent woman entered, and a church whose minister had left 2 winters ago and hadn't been replaced. The snow had come early this year, crusting the ground with an inch of gray ice before December had even arrived, and the wind that funneled between the buildings had the particular meanness of Wyoming winter, personal, almost, as if it had singled you out. Dolph pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Greer's general store and climbed down stiffly, his knees protesting. Adeline helped Maisie down first. The girl was 6, small for her age, with dark braids and her father's steady brown eyes. And then Jonah jumped down on his own, the way 12-year-old boys always do, landing harder than necessary to prove something. He looked around the main street with the careful, watchful expression he'd been wearing since his father died. Too old for his age. Adeline noticed it every day and didn't know what to do about it. "You got family here?" Dolph asked, not unkindly. "No," she said. He paused, clearly wanting to say something useful, and failing. "Well, Greer's the man to talk to if you're looking for work or a room. His wife takes in boarders sometimes." He gestured toward the store. "Tell him Dolph sent you." She thanked him. He tipped his hat at Maisie, climbed back up, and the wagon rolled on. The 3 of them stood on the frozen boardwalk while half a dozen townspeople moved around them like water around stones, glancing but not stopping. A woman in a good coat whispered something to another woman without bothering to lower her voice. Adeline caught the word widow and kept her face still. She was getting practiced at that. But inside Greer's general store, it was warmer by maybe 15 degrees, which still wasn't warm. A pot-bellied stove threw heat from one corner, and behind the long wooden counter stood a man with a gray beard and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough of life to stop being surprised by it. This was Owen Greer, and he looked at Adeline the way most men in frontier towns looked at women who arrived alone, assessing, not unkind but not exactly kind either. "Dolph Carver sent me," she said. "I'm looking for work. Anything honest. I cook, I sew, I can keep books if you need it. My son can do physical labor. He's stronger than he looks." Jonah, who was standing beside her, squared his shoulders slightly at this. He was thin and tall for 12, all elbows and determination. Greer studied her. "Where are you from?" "Nebraska, most recently. Before that, Ohio." "Husband?" "Gone. 8 months." He nodded slowly. "What's your name?" "Adeline Whitlock." Something shifted slightly in his expression, not recognition exactly, more like a memory of a conversation. "Whitlock," he repeated. "Your husband have any people out here?" "No," she said. "We don't have people anywhere, Mr. Greer. That's why I'm standing in your store." He appreciated the directness. She could see it. He leaned on the counter and glanced at the children. Maisie had found a jar of penny candy on a low shelf and was staring at it with the focused attention of a child who understood that she should not ask. "I can't give you work," he said finally. My wife does the books, and she'd have my hide if I hired someone for that, and I've got 2 boys for the heavy lifting, but—" He paused, seeming to make a decision. "You might try Hale's ranch, Gideon Hale. He's about 4 miles north, lost most of his household help last spring, hasn't replaced them. His cook walked off in September." "I've heard the name," Adeline said carefully. Greer's mouth pulled sideways. "I imagine you have. He's not an easy man, but he's a fair one, or he used to be. And he's got the biggest operation in the valley. If anyone's got work to offer through winter, it's him." He paused again. "I wouldn't send you out there if I thought he was dangerous. He's just closed up, that's all." "Closed up I can handle," Adeline said. She left the children with Mrs. Greer, who turned out to be a round-faced woman with a no-nonsense manner who took one look at Maisie and produced a plate of cornbread without being asked. This was the first genuine kindness Adeline had encountered since Laramie, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest in a way she didn't have time for. She thanked the woman, pulled her coat tight, and borrowed a horse from the livery, the last of her money against the promise of returning it by nightfall. The road to Gideon Hale's ranch was not a road so much as a frozen track through land that seemed to grow wider and more indifferent the further north she rode. The sky pressed down, the color of dirty iron, and the wind didn't let up for a single minute of the 4 miles. By the time she saw the ranch gate, solid timber, practical, no ornamentation, her fingers inside her gloves had gone from cold to aching to something past aching. The ranch itself was large. Even under snow, she could see the scale of it. The main house, the bunkhouse beyond it, the long dark shape of the barn, the corrals, the fencing that stretched away in both directions. It had been built by someone who intended to stay. It had the look of a place that used to be well kept and was now being maintained through stubbornness rather than care. The front porch had a board loose. The kitchen garden, visible beneath its snow cover, had been left with dead stalks standing. She tied the horse at the post and knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. The door opened, and the man standing in it was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. Gideon Hale was somewhere in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that had spent too many years in the weather. He was wearing work clothes, not the clothes of a man who'd been sitting indoors. He looked like he'd come in from the barn. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that doesn't make immediate sense. "Mr. Hale," she said, "my name is Adeline Whitlock. I arrived in Ash Ridge this morning. I'm looking for work." A pause. "Who sent you?" "Owen Greer suggested your name. I understand you need a cook." "I need a lot of things," he said. "Doesn't mean I'm in the habit of hiring strangers who show up unannounced." "I understand that," she said. "I'm asking for a chance to be useful, not for sympathy. I cook well. I can manage a household. My son is 12 and capable of real ranch work. My daughter is 6 and won't be a burden." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm desperate, because you'll probably already assume that, and I'd rather you judge me on the work than on my circumstances." Something moved in his expression. Not warmth exactly. More like the particular attention a person pays when they hear something unexpected. "You've got children," he said. "I do." "Where are they?" "In town, with Mrs. Greer." "You left your children in town with a woman you met this morning and rode 4 miles in that—" He gestured at the sky. "To knock on a stranger's door." "Yes," she said, "because I need to work, and I wasn't going to bring them out here until I knew whether there was something to come out here for." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind pushed between them. She did not step back from it. "Come inside," he said finally, not warmly, but not unwillingly either. "I'll hear what you're proposing." The kitchen was big, practical, and cold in the way that rooms get when no one has been paying attention to them. There were dishes in the basin that had been there too long, and the stove was running low. Adeline noticed all of this without commenting on it. She sat down at the table when he gestured at a chair, and she kept her coat on because it was that cold. Gideon poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long and set one in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it. "Talk," he said. "I'm proposing a working arrangement," she said. "I cook, clean, manage the household. My son works ranch hours alongside your hands. You pay him a hand's wages, half what you'd pay a grown man, which is fair for his age and experience. If there's a garden in spring, I can manage that too. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for fair wages and a place for my children to sleep that's warmer than the street. He leaned back in his chair and studied her. What happened to your husband? She'd been asked this question 100 times since February, and she had the answer polished smooth from repetition. But she was tired, and the coffee was helping, and something about this man's directness made her want to match it rather than deflect it. He was sick for a long time, she said. Longer than we admitted to ourselves. He died in February, and by then we'd spent most of what we had on doctors who couldn't help him. We had a farm in Nebraska, but we'd mortgaged it to pay the debts, and when he died, there wasn't enough left to save it. She kept her voice even. So I sold what I could, packed what I could carry, and started moving west. I'd heard there was work in Wyoming. There's work, he said. It's not easy work. I'm not looking for easy. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up and threw something against the side of the house. A branch, probably. The sound was sharp and brief. I had a woman cooking for me, he said. Bertha Mack, 15 years. She left in September when her daughter had a baby in Colorado and needed help. He paused. Before her, there was a housekeeper. Before that, he stopped. I'm not good at keeping household help. I'll tell you that outright. What do you mean, not good at it? He seemed almost surprised by the question. I mean, I'm not easy to work for. I keep irregular hours. I don't make conversation. I expect things done right, and I don't always explain what right means until something's done wrong. That's not so different from most employers, she said. At least you're telling me in advance. He almost smiled. Almost. The bunkhouse is full. 6 hands. I can't put a woman and 2 children there. The house has 2 spare rooms upstairs, but they haven't been opened in a while. They'd need cleaning. I can clean them. The wages I'd have paid a cook were $14 a month, he said. I'll give you that for the housekeeping. For the boy, I'll start him at what I'd pay a young hand and see how he does. There's no guarantee past the season. If winter goes bad and I need to cut, I understand, she said. I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm asking for a fair chance. He looked at her across the table. In the low light of the kitchen, he was harder to read. There was something closed off in his face, deliberately so, the expression of a man who had decided a long time ago that giving people access to what he was thinking was too expensive. Why Ash Ridge, he asked, of all the places in Wyoming? A woman I met in Cheyenne said there was good cattle country up here and that ranchers were always needing help. She wasn't wrong. She tell you about me specifically? No, you came up when I asked around in town. And nobody told you to steer clear? Several people did, Adeline said. He was quiet. I don't put much stock in reputation, she said, good or bad. People can be wrong about both kinds. Gideon Hale got up from the table, went to the window, and stood looking out at the snow-gray yard. She waited. She'd learned in recent months the particular discipline of waiting, not anxiously, not performing patience, just actually waiting. All right, he said without turning around. I'll give you a trial 2 weeks. If it works, we'll talk about the season. If it doesn't, he turned then. I'll give you a week's wages, and you can go back to town and try somewhere else. That's fair, she said. I'll ride with you to get the children. Roads will be worse by dark. She had not expected that. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I know these roads better than you do. That's the only reason. He was already reaching for his coat. The ride back into Ash Ridge was mostly silent, which suited both of them. The cold had gotten serious by mid-afternoon, the sky pressing lower, the light going thin and gray. Gideon rode on a big gray gelding that picked its way through the iced ruts with the practiced calm of a horse that had done this 1,000 times. Adeline kept up. She was a competent rider, which he noticed without commenting on. When they reached Greer's store and she went inside to collect the children, Gideon stayed outside with the horses. Through the window he watched, not intending to, just happening to, as the little girl ran to her mother and grabbed her around the middle, and as the boy straightened up and asked something, and as the woman bent down to say something in the girl's ear that made her nod. He had not had children in this house. He had not had anyone in this house in a long time who wasn't there to do a specific job and go back to the bunkhouse. He didn't know what he was doing. He told himself it was practical. He needed a cook. The boy might be useful. The arrangement was straightforward. There was nothing complicated about it. When they came out, the little girl, Maisie, looked at him with an expression that was not shy, but was measuring, the way children look at things they're not sure about yet. The boy Jonah nodded at him with a seriousness that was almost funny, except Gideon understood it, the particular seriousness of a boy who had taken on weight too young and was trying to carry it right. "Ready?" Gideon said. "Ready," Adeline said. They rode north into the darkening afternoon, into the cold that had already settled over the valley like a judgment. The children bundled behind them on the horses, the snow beginning again in small, mean flakes that meant business. Gideon did not look back at the town as they left it. He hadn't looked back at anything in a long time. That was something he was good at. He told himself this was just a practical arrangement. He told himself that 3 times before they reached the gate, which was 2 times more than something that was actually just practical usually required. The gate swung open. The horses pushed through. The house sat in the fading light, dark-windowed and quiet, waiting to see what would happen next. The first morning, Adeline woke before light. That was habit, not ambition. She'd been waking before light since Nebraska, since before that even, since the early years of her marriage when the farm demanded it, and she'd simply never stopped. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar room, getting her bearings. The mattress was better than she'd expected. The window above her was a gray rectangle of pre-dawn dark. Somewhere below, the house breathed and settled in the cold. The room she'd been given was plain: a bed, a dresser, a hook on the wall, a braided rug that had seen better years. The room next door had Jonah and Maisie in it, sharing the bed that was in there, which Maisie had decided was a fine arrangement, and Jonah had decided was beneath his dignity, but accepted without saying so. The wallpaper in both rooms was pulling away at the seams. The windows were drafty, but they were inside, and the cold was outside. And Adeline had learned in the past 8 months not to need more than that to feel something close to grateful. She dressed quickly, went downstairs, and found the kitchen. The stove was cold. The wood box beside it was almost empty. She found the axe by the back door without having to look hard. It was hanging where any sensible person would hang it. And she went out into the dark yard and split enough wood to fill the box and then some, working fast to stay warm, her breath making clouds in the black air. By the time she had the fire going and the coffee on, the sky outside the kitchen window had gone from black to the particular bruised purple that precedes a Wyoming dawn. She was looking through the pantry, taking inventory, when she heard boots on the stairs. Not Jonah's light, quick step. Heavier. Slower. Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was already dressed for the barn, heavy coat, hat in hand, and he stopped when he saw her, as though he'd expected the kitchen to be empty. "Coffee's on," she said, without turning around from the pantry. "I need to talk to you about supplies when you have a minute. You're low on salt pork and the flour sack has been visited by mice." A pause. "The barrel in the cellar has flour." "I'll find it. What time do your men eat breakfast?" 6. She glanced at the clock on the shelf, 20 past 5. "I can do that. 6 men?" "6 men, plus the 3 of us." He paused again. "You don't have to cook for the hands." "Who was cooking for them before?" "They were cooking for themselves, badly." "Then I'll cook for them," she said. "It's not much more work and it'll be good for morale." She found the cellar door and turned to look at him. "That's not charity, Mr. Hale. Happy workers work harder. It benefits you." He looked at her with that expression she was already starting to recognize, the one where he was deciding whether to argue and concluding reluctantly that there wasn't much point. "Fine," he said. He poured himself coffee, drank half of it standing at the counter, set the cup down. "Don't let Maisie near the corrals without someone with her. There's a bull in the south pen that's unpredictable." "Understood." He went out the back door. She went down to find the flour. The 6 ranch hands were not a welcoming audience at breakfast. They came in from the cold in a loose group, stomping snow off their boots, and they stopped when they saw a woman at the stove and a boy setting plates on the long table in the kitchen. The oldest of them, a weathered man named Pete Sully, somewhere past 50, with a gray mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who had outlasted a lot of situations, looked at Adeline and then at the table and then at Adeline again. "Morning," Adeline said. "Morning," Pete said carefully. The others filed in behind him. Jonah, to his credit, kept moving, setting out forks, filling water glasses from the pitcher, not making eye contact with anyone but not hiding either. He decided to treat this exactly like farm chores, which was, Adeline thought, exactly the right instinct. She put biscuits on the table, a pan of salt pork, eggs scrambled with some dried herbs she'd found in a tin. It wasn't elaborate, it was hot, and there was enough of it. The hands ate without much conversation, and the conversation that did happen was among themselves, not toward her. She didn't push it. She refilled coffee when cups were empty and left them to it. After they'd gone back out, Pete Sully stopped at the door. He turned around. "Ma'am," he said, "that was the best breakfast that kitchen's produced since Bertha Mack left." He put his hat on. "I just wanted to say." "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went out. Jonah looked at her. She looked at Jonah. "Okay," he said, with the particular tone of a 12-year-old trying not to look impressed. "That's something?" "Eat your eggs," she said. The shape of the days established itself faster than she'd expected. Adeline was up before 5, fire going, breakfast on the table by 6. After the men went out, she spent the morning on the house. There was a great deal of house and a great deal of neglect to address, not catastrophic neglect. More the steady accumulation of things that happen when a man lives alone and stops caring about anything past the functional minimum. Dust on every surface, windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in a season, linens that needed washing. She worked through it methodically, room by room, not trying to transform anything, just restore what had been let go. Jonah was out with his hands by 7 each morning because he'd asked Pete Sully on the second day if he could help, and Pete, after a measured look, had said yes. He came in each evening with a particular kind of exhaustion that was different from the exhaustion of sitting still, the satisfied tiredness of a body that had been used properly. He didn't talk much about what he did out there. He ate his dinner and fell asleep early and was up when she was. Maisie, who was 6 and therefore operated on entirely her own schedule and logic, had decided within 48 hours that the barn cat was her particular friend. The cat, a large, indifferent orange animal that Pete called Sergeant, for reasons no one seemed to remember, tolerated Maisie's attention with the resigned dignity of a creature that had made its peace with the world. Adeline checked on her every hour and found her in the barn, or on the porch, or once inexplicably in the woodshed, always with Sergeant nearby and always talking, to the cat, to herself, to no one in particular, in the quiet, continuous murmur of a child who has a rich interior life. She stayed away from the South Corral. She'd been told once, and she remembered. That was Maisie. She pushed at every boundary except the ones she understood mattered. Gideon ate dinner at the house each evening. He was not what Adeline would call a conversationalist. He answered direct questions directly and rarely offered anything beyond what was asked, but he ate what she cooked without complaint, and she was a good cook, had always been. And he didn't take up space at the table in an unpleasant way. He was simply there, quietly, present without being warm. On the 4th evening, Maisie, who had no instinct for social caution whatsoever, looked at him across the table and said, "Do you have any children?" The room went slightly tense. Jonah looked at his plate. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Did you want some?" "Maisie," Adeline said. "It's a reasonable question," Maisie said, with the certainty of a child who has not yet learned which questions are reasonable in which company. Gideon looked at the girl. Something in his face shifted, not opened exactly, more like the skin of ice over a pond that flexes without breaking. "A long time ago, I thought I might," he said. Maisie considered this. "That's sad," she said, and went back to eating her biscuit with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who has stated a fact and sees no reason to belabor it. Gideon looked down at his plate. Adeline looked at Gideon quickly and looked away. Nobody said anything for a minute. "Good biscuits," Gideon said finally. "Thank you," Adeline said. The end of the first week brought the first real test. One of the hands, a younger man named Cole Draper, maybe 22, with a quick smile he deployed too often, had developed the habit of coming into the kitchen in the evenings after dinner, ostensibly for more coffee, actually to talk at Adeline in the particular way of young men who don't know the difference between charming and wearing. She had handled it the first 2 times by being busy. The third time, he sat down at the kitchen table without being invited and said, "You know, for a widow woman, you carry yourself real well." Yes, Samnet. Adeline set down the pot she was washing and turned around. "Mr. Draper," she said, "I'm going to tell you something once, and you seem bright enough that once should be sufficient. I am an employee on this ranch, and so are you. I'm not looking for company, compliments, or conversation that isn't about the work. If that changes, I'll say so. In the meantime, if you want more coffee, the pot's on the stove. Help yourself and then go back to the bunkhouse." Cole's smile flickered and went out. He stood up, the back of his neck going red. "No offense intended, ma'am. And none will be taken so long as we understand each other." He took his coffee and left. Adeline went back to washing the pot. Her hands were steady. What she had not seen was Gideon standing in the hallway just outside the kitchen door, where he'd been heading in to leave his dinner plate and had stopped when he heard the conversation. He stood there a moment after Cole's boots had retreated down the back steps, and then he walked in and set his plate on the counter without saying anything. But the next morning, Adeline noticed that Cole Draper's manner at the breakfast table was markedly more formal, and that Gideon had said something to him in the yard. She hadn't heard what, but she'd seen it, the brief conversation, Cole listening with his hat in his hands. She didn't say anything about it. She just noted it and put it away. The second week, the temperature dropped. It didn't drop gradually. It dropped the way Wyoming temperatures drop in December, decisively, overnight, like a door slamming. Adeline woke on a Tuesday morning, and the water in the pitcher in her room had a skin of ice on it, and the window was opaque with frost on the inside. She dressed in everything she had and went downstairs and got the stove going and stood next to it for 5 minutes before she felt like herself again. Outside, it was serious cold, the kind that gets into the spaces between your thinking and makes simple tasks into problems. Gideon and the hands were out by 5:30, checking the livestock, making sure water troughs hadn't frozen solid overnight, moving the more vulnerable cattle into the shelter of the northern barn. Jonah went with them. Adeline had tried to say something about it being cold and caught Jonah's expression, not defiant exactly, just absolutely certain, and stopped herself. She put a pot of soup on at 9 in the morning and kept it simmering all day. At noon, the men came back in shifts to eat. They were cold down to their bones, the kind of cold that takes the conversation right out of you, and they sat at the table and wrapped both hands around their bowls and ate without speaking and then went back out. Jonah came in with the second group, his ears red above his scarf, and he ate fast and stood up to go back. "Your hands all right?" Adeline asked. He held them out. The knuckles were cracked and red. "They're fine." She got the tin of salve from the shelf and handed it to him. He looked at it. "Take it," she said. He took it, used it, handed it back with an expression that said he hadn't needed it but was willing to be practical. Pete Sully, eating at the end of the table, watched this without comment. After Jonah had gone back out, Pete said, "That boy's a worker." "Yes," Adeline said. "He is. Didn't inherit it from nothing." He said it casually, not looking at her, sopping the last of his soup with a piece of bread. She didn't answer, but she felt the weight of it, the honest, offhand kind of compliment that meant more than the other kind because it wasn't trying to be anything. 7. Gideon came in last, alone, after the others had gone back out. He sat at the table and she put soup in front of him and he ate it without ceremony. "How many cattle lost?" she asked. She'd heard them talking in the yard. He looked up, slightly surprised she'd been listening. 3. 2 old ones, probably would have gone anyway. 1 young heifer that didn't have any sense. He paused. "It'll get worse before it gets better." "I know," she said. "Do you need me to do anything different? For the men, I mean. More food, different hours?" "The soup helps," he said. He said it straightforwardly, not as though he was offering her something, but as though he was reporting a fact. Pete said something about it. Pete says things. He does. He's usually right. Gideon looked into his bowl. He said the boy is doing well. Adeline sat down across from him, which was something she'd started doing during the day when it was just the two of them. It seemed more natural than standing at the stove. "He needs to be doing well," she said. "He needs something to be good at, something that matters." Gideon looked at her. "His father been gone long?" 10 months. "He was close with him?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. He was close with who he thought his father was, she said slowly. His father was sick a long time. A person can change when they're sick, not who they are exactly, but how they show up. Jonah watched that for 2 years, she paused. He needs to work next to men who are just what they seem to be, no hidden parts. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Pete Sully's not complicated, he said. What you see is what's there. I know. That's why it's good. Something moved between them. Not warmth exactly, more like two people acknowledging something real about the world without flinching from it. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then Gideon finished his soup and stood up. I've got to get back out, he said. I know. Be careful on the north slope, the ice will be worse. He stopped at the door and looked back at her briefly, the way a person looks at something they're still figuring out. Then he went out. It was 3 days later that the incident happened, the one that changed the temperature of the house in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Adeline had gone to the cellar for potatoes. She was making a proper stew for dinner, the kind that needed an hour, and she was coming back up the stairs when she heard Maisie's voice from the front of the house, in the parlor where nobody really went. High-pitched, the way Maisie's voice got when she was talking to something that wasn't answering back. She set the potatoes down and went to look. Maisie was sitting on the floor of the parlor in front of the fireplace, cold. Because no one lit fires in this room, it was too formal and too empty. And she was holding a picture frame, a daguerreotype in an oval frame, the kind that sat on a stand. She'd found it on the mantel and taken it down the way small children take things down from places they're not supposed to reach. Adeline crossed the room and crouched beside her. In the picture was a woman, young, maybe 25, with light hair and an expression that photographs of that era rarely captured, but this one had somehow caught. She was almost smiling, the particular half-smile of a person who couldn't quite suppress it. Next to her, formally posed but with his hand touching her arm in a way that said more than the pose did, was a younger version of Gideon Hale. Not so different, a little less weathered. Both eyes still open to whatever was ahead of him. "Who's this?" Maisie asked. "I don't know," Adeline said, "but I think we should put it back." "She's pretty." "Yes." Adeline gently took the frame and stood up and set it back on the mantel where it had been. "We don't take things that aren't ours." "I wasn't keeping it," Maisie said reasonably. "I was just looking." "I know. Come help me with the stew." Maisie came, because she always came when food was involved, and Adeline went back to the kitchen and started peeling potatoes and did not think about the woman in the picture, except that she did, a little. She'd known there had been a wife. People in town had mentioned it obliquely, the way people mention something that is known but not spoken about directly. She hadn't asked Gideon about it because it wasn't her business, and she'd had no frame for what the loss looked like until she saw the photograph and understood. She'd been young. It had been a long time ago by the calendar and possibly no time at all in other ways. That evening at dinner, Gideon noticed that the frame on the mantel had been moved slightly, had been touched. He went still when he passed the parlor door. He didn't say anything about it at dinner, and Adeline didn't either. But after dinner, when the children were upstairs and she was washing dishes, he came into the kitchen and stood at the window the way he did sometimes, looking out at the dark yard. Maisie found the photograph, Adeline said. She wasn't going to make him work around it. She was curious. I made her put it back. A silence. Her name was Clara, Gideon said. Adeline kept washing dishes. She didn't turn around. She died 4 years ago, he said. Fever. It was fast, which people kept telling me was merciful, and maybe they were right. His voice had a particular flatness that wasn't absence of feeling, but was what feeling sounds like when a person has spent years keeping it contained. She's the reason the parlor doesn't get used. I know that's... He stopped. I know that's a strange thing. It's not strange, Adeline said. Most people would say it is. Then most people haven't lost anyone they didn't expect to lose. She turned around and looked at him. I'm sorry, Mr. Hale. I'm sorry she died. And I'm sorry if Maisie upset you. Maisie didn't upset me, he said, and then quietly, as though he was saying something he hadn't planned to, it's just been a while since anyone was in that room. Adeline nodded. She turned back to the dishes. After a moment, she heard him leave the kitchen, and then the sound of the back door, and then nothing but the wind and the fire. By the end of the second week, the trial period he'd set was over. He didn't bring it up, and neither did she. And in the absence of anything being said, the arrangement simply continued into the third week and the fourth. She took this to mean that the trial had passed to his satisfaction. She was right, though she wouldn't have known the specific moment it had. It had been the soup, in fact, the day of the hard cold, the pot that had been simmering all morning and was there when the men came in from the worst of it, and the specific thought he'd had standing over his bowl, which was that he had been feeding himself, but no one had been feeding him in a long time, and those were not the same thing. He didn't know how to say that. He wasn't sure it needed to be said. But he started, very slowly and without making a production of it, to leave the kitchen door unlocked from the inside in the evenings, so that when she came back from checking on the children, she didn't have to knock. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it either. These were the ways things moved between them, not in declarations, but in small practical gestures that meant more than they looked like, in a house that was starting, slowly, to stop feeling like a place where things used to happen and start feeling like a place where things were happening now. Outside, the winter was only deepening. The sky stayed low and iron gray for days at a time, and the temperature didn't climb above 20, and the cattle huddled at the windbreaks, and the horses needed extra feed, and the work was relentless and unglamorous and hard. Jonah came in each evening smelling of horses and cold air and honest work. And Pete Sully had started explaining things to him, not making a lesson of it, just talking while they worked, the way knowledge gets passed on the frontier, sideways and unremarked upon. One evening, Jonah said to Adeline, almost as an afterthought, "Pete says I've got good instincts with the horses." Adeline looked at her son, this boy who had been carrying something too heavy for 2 years, who had started, incrementally, to set some of it down. "Pete's right," she said. Jonah nodded, finished his dinner, carried his plate to the basin. He was 12, and he'd said it almost as an afterthought, and he hadn't looked at her when he said it, and all of those things together meant it mattered more than anything he'd said in months. She let him have it without comment. Outside, the first real blizzard of the season was building somewhere up in the mountains, moving south with the patience and indifference of a thing that doesn't know it should be stopped. In Ash Ridge, the barometer was dropping. The cattle could feel it. The horses could feel it. Gideon could feel it too. He stood on the porch after dinner, looking north at the black sky, and he knew the way ranchers know, in the bones, in the particular ache of experience, that this next week was going to ask for everything they had. He went back inside and found Adeline banking the kitchen fire for the night. "Storm coming," he said. She straightened up and looked at him. "How bad?" "Don't know yet." He was honest about it. "Could be manageable. Could be the kind that changes things." She nodded. She put the iron poker back on its hook. "Then we'll be ready," she said. Not bravely, not as a performance, just as a statement of intent. He looked at her for a moment in the firelight. This woman who had shown up at his gate with $31 and 2 children and an offer of honest work, who hadn't asked him once for anything she didn't intend to earn. "Get some sleep," he said. "Early start." She nodded and went upstairs. Gideon stood in the kitchen a while longer, listening to the wind find its way around the corners of the house, and thought about Clara, and then thought about the soup that had been waiting on the stove, and then thought about nothing in particular, the way a man thinks when he's standing at the edge of something he can't quite see yet. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. The storm came 3 days later. The storm came on a Thursday. It didn't announce itself with drama the way summer storms did. No lightning, no sudden darkening of the sky. It arrived the way the worst things do, quietly and from the north. A low gray pressure that built through the morning until by noon the visibility at the north fence line was down to maybe 30 yards, and the temperature had dropped another 12 degrees since breakfast. Gideon had been watching it since dawn. He'd sent 2 of the hands to reinforce the northern shelter and pulled the most vulnerable cattle in before 8, and he'd told Pete to keep everyone close to the barn and not go past the first marker posts under any circumstances. By 2 in the afternoon, the world outside the windows was white and moving. Adeline kept the stove loaded and the soup pot full and didn't say anything about fear because there was nothing useful to say about it. Maisie had been inside all day, which she'd accepted with the pragmatism of a child who understood weather even if she couldn't have named why. She sat at the kitchen table drawing on the back of an old feed receipt with a stub of charcoal pencil. Horses, mostly, the way children draw them, round-bodied and cheerful. And Sergeant the barn cat was on the chair beside her, which meant someone had let him in, which meant Jonah had let him in without being asked, which was the kind of thing Jonah did now without making a production of it. Jonah was not inside. He was in the barn with Pete and two of the other hands, keeping the horses calm. Gideon had told him he could come in, and Jonah had looked at him with that steady, too old look and said, "I'd rather stay." And Gideon had looked at him for a moment and said, "All right," because that was the right answer to give a boy who was telling you something true about himself. Adeline stood at the kitchen window and watched the white nothing outside and told herself that the barn was 40 yards from the house, and Pete Sully had survived 25 Wyoming winters, and her son was a sensible boy. She told herself these things several times. It was Gideon who came in at 3:30 with the news. He came through the back door with snow packed into every fold of his coat, his face raw and red, and he pulled off his hat and said, "The north fence is down." She turned from the stove. "How much of it?" 150 yards, maybe more. The drifting hit the posts wrong. He was already moving to the map he kept pinned on the wall near the back door, a hand-drawn thing, faded at the edges, that showed the ranch boundaries and the pasture divisions. He put his finger on it. "Here. That's the section where we had the yearlings and about 60 head of the breeding stock. If they've pushed through, where would they go?" "North and east. There's a draw about 2 miles out that catches drifting snow in a bad storm. Cattle will walk into it and not come out." He said it flatly, without dramatizing it, which was somehow worse than if he'd been upset. "How many men do you need?" "All of them." He was pulling his coat back on already. "I need to go now, every hour." "Go," she said. He stopped and looked at her. "Keep Maisie inside. Don't let anyone outside without a rope tied to the house. Visibility is going to zero out in the next hour." "I know. If we're not back by—" "Gideon." She said his name, his first name, without thinking about it, the first time she had. "Go get your cattle. I'll keep the lights on." He went. What happened in the next 3 hours was the kind of thing that doesn't organize itself into a clean story afterward. It was cold, and confusion, and noise, and work, and the pieces of it came back to the people involved in fragments rather than sequence. Gideon took 4 of the hands north on horseback, ropes tied saddle to saddle in a loose chain so no one could get separated in the whiteout. The wind was bad, the kind that doesn't just chill you, but pushes you, that has weight and intention. The horses didn't want to go north. Gideon's gray pushed through because he asked it to and because they had an understanding, that horse and man, built over years of exactly this kind of situation. Pete had stayed at the barn with Jonah and one other hand, a quiet man named Reeves, to keep the remaining livestock from panicking and breaking through their own gates. The horses were the main concern. Spooked horses in a blizzard could injure themselves and anyone near them within seconds. And Pete moved through the barn with the calm authority of a man who had been doing this longer than most of the horses had been alive. Jonah worked beside him. He wasn't talking, which Pete had learned was normal for the boy. He didn't fill silence with noise the way some young people did. He worked. He moved from stall to stall, speaking low to the animals, one hand always on a neck or a flank, and the horses that had been stamping and rolling their eyes went quieter when he came near them. Pete watched this and did not comment on it. Some things you just let be. It was Jonah who heard it first. He came out of the last stall and stopped, his head tilted. The wind was a constant roar against the barn walls, and through it, or possibly under it, there was something else. A sound that didn't belong. "Pete," he said. Pete was across the barn. "What?" "Listen." Pete came and they both stood still, and in the next gap between gusts they both heard it, the particular creak and groan of wood under lateral stress, the sound of something built to be stationary being asked to move. "That's the north wall of the calving shed," Pete said. He was already moving. The calving shed was connected to the main barn by a covered passage, and it was older than the main barn by 10 years and showed it. Pete went through the passage fast, Jonah behind him, and they came into the calving shed to find the north wall bowing inward under the pressure of the drifted snow that had piled against it outside. One of the main support posts was leaning at an angle it had not been designed for. There were 8 calves in the shed. Most of them had been born early, too early for this kind of cold, and they were huddled in the center of the space as far from the walls as they could get, which was cattle instinct working correctly for once. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before that post goes," Pete said. "What do we do?" "Move them to the main barn. Fast." Pete was already pulling on a lead rope. "Take two at a time. Don't let them bunch up at the passage door." "I know," Jonah said, and he took a rope and went. They moved the calves in 4 trips, Pete and Jonah going back and forth through the passage, while Reeves held the main barn door from the inside. The calves did not want to be moved. Calves never want to be moved, under any circumstances, and in the noise and cold of the blizzard, they were particularly unconvinced. Jonah's arm got knocked hard against the door frame on the 2nd trip, and he kept going. On the 4th trip, Pete was ahead of him in the passage with the last 2 calves when the post in the north wall gave way with a sound like a rifle shot, and 6 feet of the upper wall came inward in a cascade of snow and split timber. It came inward behind Jonah. He was already through the door. He stood in the main barn with his heart going very fast and a bruise developing on his forearm and snow in his hair, and he looked at Pete. Pete looked back at him. "You all right?" Pete said. "Yeah," Jonah said. His voice was steady. He seemed almost surprised to discover this. Pete put one hand briefly on the back of the boy's neck, the way men do on the frontier, that rough, wordless acknowledgement that means more than most things that come with words. And then he let go and went to check on the calves. Jonah stood still for another 2 seconds. Then he went to help. Gideon found the cattle. Some of them, anyway. He found the main group about 1.5 miles north, packed into a natural windbreak formed by 2 rock outcroppings, which was dumb luck. Cattle didn't usually have the sense to find shelter, but the topography had funneled them there when they'd pushed through the broken fence, and they'd stopped moving when they hit the rocks. 53 head. He counted twice to be sure. The other 8 were not with them. He sent 2 of the hands to start moving the main group back south with one of the rope lines as a guide, and he took the other 2 men east toward the draw he'd been thinking about since he'd left the house. The snow was so thick now that he navigated more by memory and compass bearing than by sight. He'd ridden this land for 12 years. He knew where the draw was. They found 5 cattle at the edge of it. 2 had gone in far enough to be in trouble, standing chest-deep in drifted snow and unable to move under their own power. The men roped them and pulled them out, which was slow and ugly work. One of the hands went down from his horse when the animal stumbled on hidden ice and came up swearing and limping but intact. 3 cattle they did not find. Gideon sat on his horse at the edge of the draw, in the white, howling dark, and made himself account for the mathematics. 3 head. Against a herd of several hundred. Against the fence repairs and the hands he still had, and the calving that would start in February. He made himself be rational about it, the way a rancher has to be rational about loss, because a man who can't be rational about loss out here will not last. He turned his horse south, but his jaw was tight the whole ride back, and his hands inside his gloves were clenched in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. They came back to the ranch in pieces, the different groups filtering in through the barn door over the course of an hour, and Adeline had soup and coffee waiting and didn't ask questions until everyone was inside and the doors were shut. She moved through the barn with cups of coffee, stepping over the calves that were now in the main space, not commenting on the wall of the calving shed that was visibly wrong from the barn door. She found Jonah sitting on an overturned bucket, drinking coffee with both hands the way adults do. She stood next to him. She didn't say anything. He looked up at her and she could see it on his face, the particular expression of a person who has been afraid and came through it and is still processing the distance between those 2 things. "The calving shed wall came down," he said. "We got them all out." "I know, Pete told me." "Did he say—" Jonah stopped. "He said you kept your head." She looked at her son. "He said he'd want you beside him in the next one." Jonah looked back down at his coffee. His ears went red. He had his father's ears, that particular shape, and she had to look away for a moment at something that wasn't his face. "It wasn't that hard," he said, the way 12-year-old boys say things that are the opposite of what they mean. "I know," she said. "Drink your coffee." Gideon came in last. He came through the barn, did a slow circuit of the animals, stopped at the calving shed door, and looked at the damage for a long moment without moving. Pete came and stood beside him. "We got all 8 calves out," Pete said. "No losses in the barn." "The wall?" Repairable. 3-4 days work. The north fence? 160 yards, best guess. Posts are salvageable. Wire's a different question. Gideon nodded. He was quiet. We lost 3 head in the draw, he said. I heard. 53 came back. The 5 from the east draw are weak, but they'll survive. He said it all in the flat, accounting voice. The breeding stock is intact. The yearlings are intact. Then we came out of it, Pete said. Not cheerfully, just as a statement of the arithmetic. Gideon didn't answer for a moment. He was looking at the calves, awkward, damp, alive, in their new spaces in the main barn. The boy did good, Pete said. I heard. Pete went back to check on something. Gideon stood there a minute longer, and then he went inside. The kitchen was warm. That was the first thing. Adeline was at the stove, and Maisie was asleep in the chair beside the fire. Actually, asleep, curled up sideways with Sargent across her feet, a drawing still in one hand. The sight of it, the particular piece of a sleeping child who had been afraid all day and was now safe, went into Gideon in a way he hadn't expected. He stood in the doorway for a moment too long. Adeline turned. She saw his face, the cold in it, and the something else underneath the cold. And she didn't say anything about the cattle or the fence or the damage count. She just poured him coffee and set it on the table. He sat down. He put both hands around the cup. The heat of it was sharp after hours in the cold, almost painful the way warmth sometimes is. How bad, she said. Could have been worse. He said it without looking up. We lost 3 head. The calving shed needs a wall. The north fence is down 160 yards. But the breeding stock, safe. He drank. All of them. She sat down across from him, not making a production of it, just sitting. Outside, the wind was still going, but the quality of it had changed, still mean, but finished with its worst. They'd seen the back of it. Pete told me what Jonah did, Gideon said. I know. He pulled 8 calves out of a shed that was coming down. He didn't freeze up. He didn't run. He looked up at her finally. That boy is... He stopped. He seemed to run out of words for a moment, which she understood was not a common occurrence. He's going to be something, if someone gives him the room to be. Adeline looked at him. You're giving him the room. Pete is. You gave Pete permission too? She paused. That's not nothing. Gideon looked back down at his coffee. He was quiet for a long stretch, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of thought, but is thought, working itself out. I had a hand when I was young, he said. On my father's ranch, man named Aldous. He wasn't warm, he wasn't easy, but he showed me things. He turned the cup slowly in his hands. Took me a long time to understand that someone showing you how to do something right is one of the better things one person can do for another. Adeline didn't say anything. She waited. I'm not good at talking about things, he said. I know. I just meant... He stopped again. I'm glad the boy was here tonight. So am I, she said. They sat there in the warm kitchen with the wind working at the eaves and Maisie asleep in the chair, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while. The next 3 days were repair. Everyone worked. There was no distinction drawn between what was Gideon's job and what was the hand's job and what was Adeline's job. There was just the damage and the work to fix it, and everyone picked up whatever needed picking up. Adeline organized the food and kept the stove going around the clock and helped where she could, and where she couldn't, she stayed out of the way, which she'd learned was its own kind of skill. Jonah worked the fence line with Pete and 2 of the hands. Real work, post-driving and wire stretching in temperatures that were still well below freezing. Work that left your hands bleeding at the knuckles and your back screaming by midday. He came in each evening and ate everything on his plate and didn't complain about any of it. Cole Draper, who had been a source of mild friction in the first weeks, worked without complaint and without drama through all 3 days of repairs, and somewhere in the middle of the second day, Adeline noticed that he and Jonah had started talking. Not friends exactly, but the way people become functional when there's enough work to do together. Cole was showing Jonah something about wire tension. Jonah was listening with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. Adeline watched this from the distance of the barn door and felt something ease in her chest that had been tight for a long time. On the third evening, when the fence was done and the calving shed wall was three-quarters rebuilt and the cattle were back where they belonged and the exhaustion had settled into the house like a presence of its own, Gideon called everyone together in the barn. Not formally, he just went to the barn and the hands gathered because that's where he was. He stood in the middle of the barn with his hat in his hand and said, "We came through it better than we had any right to." He said it simply. "Every one of you did what needed doing. The fence is back. The herd is intact." He looked around at each of them, Pete, Reeves, Cole, the others. Then his gaze landed briefly on Jonah. "I don't take that for granted." That was all he said. Pete nodded once, the others nodded. They went back to the bunkhouse. Jonah walked back to the house beside Adeline, their boots crunching on the hard-packed snow, and he said without particular ceremony, "He's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Jonah thought about it. "I don't know. Someone harder." "He is hard," Adeline said. "Yeah, but—" He stopped, working at the idea the way he worked at things, carefully, without rushing it. "It's not the cold kind, it's the other kind." She didn't answer right away. They reached the porch steps, and she stopped on the bottom one and looked out at the dark valley, at the snow that glittered faintly under the cloud-covered stars. "The other kind is what's left," she said, "when a person loses something and decides to keep going anyway." Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Like us." She looked at her son. This boy who was almost 13 and had driven cattle through a fence break at 12, who had pulled calves out of a collapsing shed and come out the other side still standing. "Like us," she said. What the storm had done, in the way storms sometimes do without intending to, was strip something down. Before it, they had all been operating in careful, defined roles. Adeline the cook and housekeeper, Jonah the young hand on trial, Gideon the employer maintaining his particular distance. The blizzard had not allowed for those definitions. In the 3 days of work after it, those definitions had not reasserted themselves in quite the same way, and in the absence of them, something else had moved in, something that didn't have a name but felt like the first solid thing Adeline had stood on in 8 months. She noticed it in small ways. Gideon stopping in the kitchen not just to eat, but sometimes to say something about the cattle, about the fencing, once about a question he had about the supply list. Nothing personal, just more than there had been before. Jonah coming in from the barn and telling them both something Pete had said, not directing it to his mother alone, but to the room, to whoever was in it. Maisie, who had appointed herself the official keeper of Sargent, reporting each morning on his condition and activities with the seriousness of a field correspondent. 4 days after the storm, Gideon came into the kitchen in the evening and found Adeline mending by the stove and Jonah doing figures at the table. Real arithmetic, the kind ranching required, acreage and feed costs and head counts, because Pete had given him a problem to work out and he'd brought it inside. And Gideon sat down at the table and looked at what Jonah was doing and said, "Your feed-to-head ratio is off. You're calculating for breeding weight, not yearling weight." And Jonah looked at him and said, "Show me." And Gideon showed him. It was nothing. It was a math problem at a kitchen table. But Adeline, mending by the fire, did not look up from her work. And the lamplight fell across all three of them, and outside the snow lay quiet and silver over the valley, and something that had been broken for a long time felt, in that unremarkable moment, on its way to being a little less so. She didn't make anything of it. She kept mending. But she felt it. Maisie got sick on the 5th day after the storm. Not gravely sick, a child sick, a fever and a cough that was more miserable than dangerous, but sick enough that Adeline kept her in bed and sat with her through the long afternoon, reading to her from the one book she'd carried from Nebraska, a worn collection of stories whose binding was held together with a strip of cloth she'd sewn there herself. Maisie ran her fever and slept and woke and asked for water and went back to sleep again. It was the middle of the evening when Gideon knocked on the doorframe of the room. He was holding a cup. "Pete makes a thing," he said, with the particular discomfort of a man who is doing something kind and is not sure how to frame it. "Honey and hot water and I don't know what else. He says it helps with cough." Adeline took the cup and turned to the bed where Maisie was awake, watching from her pillow. "Pete made you something for the cough," Adeline said. Maisie looked at the cup, then at Gideon in the doorway. "Did you bring it?" she said. "Pete made it," he said, "but you brought it." He didn't have an answer to this that was more efficient than the truth. Yes, he said. Maisie accepted this as appropriate. Thank you, she said very seriously. It might taste bad, he said. Pete's remedies usually do. Maisie tasted it. She made a face that confirmed this assessment. Then she drank it anyway, with the philosophical resignation of a child who has learned that things that help you are frequently unpleasant. Gideon left. Adeline settled Maisie back against the pillow and looked at the empty doorway for a moment. She thought about a man who had spent 4 years alone in a house that still held a photograph he couldn't put away, who had let a widow and her children occupy 2 rooms upstairs and had, without making a speech about it, without demanding recognition, started caring whether the sick one had something for her cough. She thought about what Jonah had said, the other kind of hard. She pulled the blanket up around Maisie's shoulders. Sleep, she said. Is it going to snow more? Maisie asked. Probably. Good, Maisie said, with her eyes already closing. I like it here when it snows. Adeline sat in the chair beside the bed for a long time after the girl was asleep, with her hands in her lap, listening to the house settle around her in the cold. Maisie was better by the second day. She came downstairs on a Tuesday morning with her hair loose and her color back, and she announced that Sargent had been waiting outside the bedroom door all night, which Pete confirmed was probably true because the cat had not been in the bunkhouse where he usually slept. And Pete had noted his absence the way a man notes the absence of something he pretends not to care about. Maisie ate 2 biscuits and a bowl of porridge and declared herself fully recovered, and that was the end of that. But something had shifted during those 2 days of the girl's fever, and Adeline felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. Not something you can point to, more something your body knows before your mind catches up. Gideon had been quieter than usual. Not his regular quiet, which was the quiet of a man who had simply decided that silence was more efficient than words. This was a different quality of quiet, the quiet of someone turning something over. She didn't ask about it. She went back to the work of the house and the ranch, and January deepened around them, and the days had a shape to them now that they hadn't had in December, a rhythm that all 5 of them moved through without having to negotiate it each morning. That was the thing about surviving something hard together. It established a grammar between people. You stopped having to explain yourself as much. The trouble with Ash Ridge arrived on a Wednesday in the form of a man named Harlan Boggs. Adeline was in town for supplies, the first trip she'd made to Greer's since before the blizzard, with a list and the ranch wagon and Jonah beside her to help load, when she first saw him. He was standing outside the post office in a good coat that was too good for the weather, talking to 2 men she didn't recognize. And there was something about the way he stood, too comfortable, too settled, the posture of a man who considers himself the most important person in whatever space he occupies. That made her pay attention without quite knowing why. Owen Greer was behind his counter when she came in, and his expression when she mentioned the man outside was the particular expression of a person who has opinions they've decided are not safe to voice too loudly. Harlan Boggs, he said, keeping his voice low in the way of small-town discretion. Came up from Cheyenne about 6 weeks ago. Says he's a land developer, looking at properties in the valley. What kind of properties? Greer moved the can of beans she'd set on the counter and put it in her pile without making eye contact. The kind that other people currently own. He paused. He's been making offers on some of the smaller homesteads. The Purdy place took it last month. Family was struggling. I think the money looked good to them. The Albertsons are thinking about it. What's he want with Valley Land? Claims he's got investors back east who want to establish a large consolidated operation. Buy up the small claims, run them together under one management. He finally looked at her. The numbers he's offering are not generous, but they're cash. And cash in hand is hard to argue with when you've had a bad year. Adeline thought about this while she finished her list. She thought about the way Boggs had been standing outside, the ease of him, the certainty. A man who had already decided what was going to happen and was just working through the sequence. She didn't say anything about it when she got back to the ranch. She filed it away and thought about it for 2 days before she mentioned it to Gideon. Gosh, she chose an evening when the house was quiet. Maisie in bed, Jonah doing his figures at the kitchen table, almost ready to turn in himself. She'd started leaving those moments at the end of the evening, the half hour or so after dinner when the work was done and the day was winding down, because those were the times Gideon was most likely to actually talk. Not about anything important usually, about the cattle, about the weather. Once about a horse he'd had as a young man that he'd mentioned in passing and then, when she'd asked about it, actually described. She'd learned that he talked about things sideways. You had to be patient and come at things from an angle. "Have you heard of a man named Harlan Boggs?" she said. Gideon was sitting across the table with his own coffee, the way he did some evenings now. He looked up. "Where'd you hear that name?" "Greer mentioned him when I was in town." He set his cup down. Something in his face changed. Not alarm exactly, more like the expression of someone who has been waiting for a thing to arrive and is not surprised to see it, but is not pleased either. "He came out here 3 weeks ago," he said, "before the storm." "He made you an offer?" "He made me a speech about consolidation and modern ranching practices and the benefits of scale, and somewhere in the middle of it, there was a number." He picked up his cup again. "I told him to get off my property." "Was the number low?" The number was an insult dressed up as generosity. He said it without particular heat, just as a fact. "My land has water rights that run back 15 years. That draw the cattle pushed into in the storm. It's my land. The creek that feeds the south pasture is on my land. Nobody runs cattle in this valley without access to water, and if Boggs gets enough parcels around me, he can effectively dictate how this ranch operates." He paused. "He knows that. That's why the number was low. He's betting I either don't understand what I have or I need the money badly enough not to care. But is he right about either?" "No." Jonah had stopped doing his figures and was listening. He wasn't pretending not to listen, which Adeline appreciated. He'd gotten past that at least. "What's he going to do when he can't get what he wants from you?" Jonah said. Gideon looked at the boy. "Keep trying," he said, "or find another way around it. Men like Boggs don't walk away because the first approach didn't work." "What other way around is there?" "That's what I've been thinking about." He turned the cup in his hands. "There are 2 homestead claims that border my north and east lines. The Fenwick claim and the old Marsh property. Marsh died in the fall, no family. If Boggs gets either of those, he starts to have leverage." He stopped. "Marsh's place is going to go to county if no one files a legal claim. There might be a way to—" He stopped again. "You thinking about buying it?" Adeline said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 months." He looked at her directly. "The problem is that buying it and running it are 2 different questions. I don't have the hands to manage another property through the winter and into calving season, and I don't have family to put on it." The word landed in the room with a weight that nobody acknowledged directly. Jonah went back to his figures. Adeline looked at her coffee. After a moment, Gideon said, "I'll figure it out," in the tone of a man closing a subject. He finished his coffee and stood up and said goodnight and went upstairs. Adeline sat at the table after he was gone, with the word family still in the room, and thought about the way he'd said it, not as something he had, but as something that solved a problem. And then she thought about how those 2 things were not, in her experience, actually separate. Pete Sully told her about Clara on a Thursday afternoon in the barn. She hadn't asked. She'd been in the barn checking on one of the mares who had been favoring her left foreleg, and Pete had come in to do the same, and they'd stood together looking at the horse with the easy silence of 2 people who have been working alongside each other long enough that silence doesn't require explaining. And then Pete said, out of nowhere in particular, he was different before she died. Adeline didn't ask who. How different? Pete thought about it with the honesty of someone who is going to say the thing accurately or not say it at all. Talked more. Laughed sometimes, not often. Gideon's never been a laughing man, but sometimes. Had plans that weren't just about the herd. He rubbed the mare's nose. She was a good woman, practical. She didn't put up with much nonsense from him, which he needed, because when he was younger, he had a head that could get pretty full of itself. A pause. After she died, it was like he just narrowed down. Everything got smaller, just the ranch, just the work. Adeline kept looking at the horse. He built a wall. Built a wall, bricked it, pointed the mortar. Pete glanced at her sideways. It's been coming down some, since you came. She didn't say anything. I'm not trying to make something out of nothing, Pete said, with the particular care of a man who wants to be clear. He's not meddling while actively offering information. I've worked for this man for 9 years. I've seen what he's been. And I see what's been different. He straightened up from the mayor. He brought that remedy down to Maisie himself. He hasn't done anything like that for any person in 4 years. Adeline looked at the old foreman. His face was weathered and honest and not trying to do anything except tell her something true. I know, she said quietly. Right, Pete said, and went back to his work. Holt. It was the following Saturday that things between Adeline and Gideon cracked open in a way that neither of them had planned. It started with a practical conversation and became something else, the way those conversations sometimes do. Gideon had been working on the ranch accounts at the desk in the small room off the parlor that served as his office, a room that smelled of leather and old paper, and the particular dusty odor of a man who keeps records carefully because records are how you keep from getting taken. And he'd come to the kitchen for more coffee and found Adeline at the table with the household accounts, which she'd been keeping for the past 6 weeks in a small ledger she'd bought from Greer. I can do those, he said. You do the ranch accounts, she said. These are the household accounts. It makes sense for me to keep them. He poured his coffee. He stood at the counter. He seemed about to go back to his office, and then didn't. Can I see? He said. She turned the ledger toward him. He sat down and looked at it. The neat columns, the careful entries, the monthly totals. She kept good books. Better than good, actually. There was a clarity to the way she'd organized it, a logic that made the information easy to read. You've been economizing on the flour order, he said. Greer's price went up in January. I found a supplier in the next town over who's cheaper, and I've been getting the difference sent with the Phoenix wagon when they come down. She paused. I should have told you. Why didn't you? She considered this honestly. I wasn't sure it was my place to make that decision. He looked at her. You're running the household. I know, but it's your money. If you're saving me money, it's still my money, just more of it. He looked back at the ledger. You don't need to ask permission for decisions that are clearly within good judgment. She took the ledger back. I'll remember that. A pause. He turned his coffee cup. I want to talk to you about something, he said, and the particular way he said it, direct but with an undercurrent of something that was not his usual flat practicality, made her put the ledger down and look at him. All right, she said, the Marsh property. He looked at his hands. I've been thinking about filing a claim on it. The county deadline is the 1st of February, which is 3 weeks out. The property has a working well, a small cabin that needs work, about 400 acres of decent grazing. You told me about this. I told you part of it. He was quiet for a moment. What I didn't say is that the reason I haven't filed already is that I've been trying to work out whether what's happening here is... He stopped. He seemed to be choosing between different versions of what he wanted to say. Whether it's something that makes sense to plan around. Adeline kept her face still. What does that mean? It means... He exhaled. He looked up at her, and this time he didn't look away from it. It means that in 2 months you have put this house back in order and kept 6 men fed and managed a blizzard and kept your head when most people wouldn't have, and your son is turning into someone Pete Sully respects, which is not a thing Pete gives away easily, and your daughter... He paused, and something moved across his face that she thought might be the thing that happened to men who miss children without having had them. Your daughter has made this house into something I didn't think it could be again. Adeline sat very still. I'm not good at this, he said. Saying things. Clara always said I communicated best in writing, and she wasn't wrong. A brief, uncomfortable pause. What I'm trying to say is that the arrangement I offered you in December was fair, but it was small. It was the smallest version of what I could have offered, and I've been sitting with that for several weeks. What's the larger version, she said. Her voice was even. She was working to keep it even. He looked at her directly. You stop calling this a business arrangement. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves the way it always did in January, that low, constant note. Gideon, she said carefully, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. I'm saying that I would like you and Jonah and Maisie to stay. Not through the season, not on a trial that gets reassessed every few weeks. He was not a man who looked away from hard things once he'd decided to look at them. And he didn't look away now. I'm saying I want to file on the Marsh property with a family that can be attached to it legally, And I'm saying that the family I have in mind is the one that's been in this house since December. She was quiet. I know this isn't... He stopped. I know I'm not easy. I know the house is not... I know there are things here that are difficult. The photograph in the parlor, the room I don't go into, I'm not pretending those aren't there. I know they're there, she said. I'm not asking you to pretend Clara didn't exist. I wouldn't. I'm asking you to... He was running out of words, which seemed to frustrate him in a real invisible way. I'm asking you to consider that whatever this has been for the past 2 months might be worth building something on, something permanent, something with a legal foundation and a name attached to it. Adeline looked at this man who had spent 4 years alone in a house with a photograph he couldn't put away, who had brought fever remedy to a sick child he had no obligation toward, who had looked at her son and seen someone worth teaching, and she thought about what she had come to Ash Ridge with. $31, 2 children, a dead man's name that meant nothing here. She thought about Nebraska and the farm that was gone, and the 2 years of illness and the 8 months of afterward. She thought about what she actually needed. I'm going to say something that might sound strange, she said. All right. I'm not going to say yes because I need to be rescued. She held his gaze. I need you to understand that. I would find a way through this winter, and the next one with or without this conversation. I'm not agreeing because I'm afraid of the alternative. He nodded once. I know that. Do you? Adeline. He said her name with a deliberateness that made it mean something. If I wanted someone who needed rescuing, I wouldn't have hired you. I wanted someone who would stand in my kitchen and tell me what was wrong with my flower order. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to it. I got that. She looked at him for a long moment. The children, she said. They're part of this. Not in addition to it. Part of it. Yes. Jonah is going to have opinions about this. I know. He might say no. Gideon paused at this. Would you let him? She thought about it honestly. I'd listen to him. I'd take it seriously. He's the man of what was left of our family, and he knows it, and that means something. She paused. But he's also 12, and he respects you, and I think he knows things are better here than they were. Then we talked to him, Gideon said. We. The word was so small and had so much in it. All right, Adeline said. We talked to him. They talked to Jonah that evening after dinner. Not in a formal way. There was no gathering around the table with serious faces, because that would have made Jonah defensive in exactly the way 12-year-olds get defensive when they sense they're being managed. Instead, after Maisie had gone up to bed, Gideon had simply stayed at the table, and Adeline had stayed and Jonah had stayed because he'd seen his mother's expression and understood that something was happening. Gideon told him directly. He didn't soften it or package it. He said what he'd said to Adeline, in fewer words, and then he stopped talking and waited. Jonah looked at the table for a long time. You're asking us to stay, he said finally. Yes. Permanently. Yes. Jonah looked at his mother. She didn't nod or shake her head. She just looked back at him. What happens to... He stopped. He started again. What name would we use? That's a question with a legal answer and a different kind of answer, Gideon said. The legal answer depends on choices we'd make. The other kind of answer, he paused, that's something that gets figured out over time. I'm not asking you to call me something you don't feel. I'm asking you to consider whether this is a place you want to be. Jonah was quiet for a long time. Pete said the east pasture's going to need reseeding in spring, he said. Gideon blinked slightly. It is. He said it was going to be a lot of work. Jonah was still looking at the table. He said whoever did it was going to need to know what they were doing. A pause. He said he'd show me. Adeline looked at her son, this particular and careful person who had, in his own way, just said yes. Gideon looked at him too. Then you'd better be ready for early mornings in March. Jonah finally looked up. He met Gideon's eyes, and there was something in the look they exchanged that wasn't words and didn't need to be. I'm usually up before 5, Jonah said. I know, Gideon said. They did not make an occasion of it. There was no announcement, no ceremony, nothing that required an audience. Gideon rode to town the following Monday and spoke to the county clerk about the Marsh property and filed the necessary paperwork and came back and told Adeline it was done. And she said good, and that was the extent of it, at least for that day. What did happen in the days that followed was small and accumulative and didn't announce itself. Gideon started eating breakfast with the family before the hands came in, instead of after. Not every morning, he was still a man who kept his own hours, but often enough that it became a thing that happened rather than a thing that didn't. Jonah started asking him questions directly instead of routing them through Pete, and Gideon answered them the same way, without the slight formality that had been there before. Maisie, who had been operating entirely on her own social logic since the beginning and had never particularly acknowledged the distance between herself and Gideon, noticed none of this change because to her there had not been a distance in the first place. "She treats me like I've always been here," Gideon said one evening. He said it with a slight bewilderment that was almost funny. "She does that with everyone she decides to trust," Adeline said. "She decided about you sometime in the first week." "How do you know?" "She stopped watching you when you came into a room." Adeline kept her eyes on the mending in her hands. "When Maisie's watching you, she's still making up her mind. When she stops watching, she's done." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara would have—" He stopped. Adeline waited. "She would have liked Maisie," he said. He said it quietly, and with a steadiness that told her he had made some private peace with the saying of it. Clara had that same quality. She decided things about people fast, and she was usually right. "She sounds like she was a good person," Adeline said. "She was." He said it without elaboration, and she understood that it was complete as stated, that he was not going to qualify it or bracket it with anything, and that this was its own kind of honesty. The photographs stayed on the mantel in the parlor. Neither of them suggested moving it. Harlan Boggs came back on a Friday afternoon in late January. Adeline was the one who answered the door, because Gideon was in the far pasture, and she was nearest. She opened the door, and there he was, that expensive coat, that too-easy posture, a smile that was the kind of smile you find on a man who has decided you're going to agree with him before the conversation starts. "Ma'am," he said, looking at her with a recalibrating expression that suggested he hadn't expected a woman. "I'm looking for Gideon Hale." "He's not in," she said. "Can I help you?" "I don't think so." He said it pleasantly, but it landed the way condescension usually does, dressed up as friendliness. "I'll come back." "I can give him a message." "That's all right." He was already turning. He stopped as though a thought had just occurred to him. "You the housekeeper?" "I'm Adeline Hale," she said. It came out of her mouth before she'd decided to say it, or perhaps she had decided in the half-second between his question and her answer that it was exactly the right thing to say. "And you're Mr. Boggs." That recalibrated him more significantly. He looked at her with new attention, less dismissive, more calculating. "I wasn't aware Gideon had married," he said. "There are a lot of things about this ranch you're not aware of," she said pleasantly. "I'll tell him you called." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, her heart going a little faster than usual, and heard his boots on the porch steps and the sound of a horse moving away. She went to the window and watched him ride toward the road. Then she went to put more coffee on, because Gideon was going to come in from the pasture and she was going to tell him what had happened, and she thought he'd want to be drinking something when she did. He came in at dusk, cold and tired in the particular way of men who have been on horseback in the wrong weather, and she told him straight through, including what she'd said at the end. He stood at the kitchen counter with his coffee and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Adeline Hale," he said. "I know. I apologize if—" "Don't apologize." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she'd seen before, that particular quality of attention that meant he was deciding something, or had already decided it and was working out how to say so. It was the right thing to say. She looked back at him. "We should probably," he said carefully, "make it true." The kitchen was warm. The fire was going. Outside, the last gray light was leaving the sky above the valley, and the stars were beginning in the east, and the snow lay clean and unbroken across the pastures as far as either of them could see. "Yes," she said, "we probably should." They were married on the second Saturday of February, in Owen Greer's general store because the church still didn't have a minister, and the county clerk doubled as a justice of the peace, and nobody felt the need to make more of it than it was. Adeline wore her good dress, which was dark blue wool and had a small tear at the left cuff she'd repaired so neatly it was almost invisible. Gideon wore his best coat and had gotten his hair cut the day before, which Maisie had noticed and approved of with the seriousness of a 6-year-old who considers personal grooming a matter of character. Jonah stood beside his mother in a shirt that was slightly too short in the sleeves because he'd grown 2 inches since Nebraska, and they hadn't had the occasion to address it. He stood straight anyway. The ceremony took 11 minutes. The clerk, a dry-mannered man named Aldrich, who had performed perhaps 30 of these and had the practiced economy of someone who understood that the meaning was in the decision, not the words surrounding it, read what needed reading and asked what needed asking. Gideon said yes in the flat, certain voice of a man who has thought a thing through entirely before committing to it. Adeline said yes in a voice that was quieter, but no less certain. Owen Greer and his wife were witnesses. Mrs. Greer cried a little, which she seemed faintly embarrassed about. Her husband patted her hand. Maisie, who had been told to stand still, stood still for approximately 4 minutes, and then sat down on a flour sack and began a whispered conversation with herself that nobody could quite make out. When it was done, Gideon looked at Adeline and she looked at Gideon, and there was a moment between them that was private in a room full of people. The particular moment of 2 people who have been through something hard together and have decided, eyes open, to keep going. And then Maisie said, "Can we eat now?" And the moment became what it was, which was a beginning. Harlan Boggs did not give up easily. That had never been likely. 2 weeks after the marriage, a letter arrived at the ranch from a law office in Cheyenne asserting that there were irregularities in the water rights documentation attached to the Hale property, specifically the creek rights in the South Pasture, and requesting that the relevant deeds be produced for examination within 30 days. The letter was written in the careful, elaborate language of a man who has paid someone to make a simple threat sound like a reasonable inquiry. Gideon read it at this kitchen table without changing his expression. He read it a second time and then set it down. "Boggs," Adeline said. "Boggs," he confirmed. She picked it up and read it herself. Her expression while reading it was the expression she got when she was annoyed and was deciding how annoyed to be. "The water rights in the South Pasture," she said. "How old are those documents?" "Filed in 1871, properly witnessed. I've had them 12 years without anyone questioning them." "Where are they?" "Locked box in the office." She set the letter down. "Then we produce them, and we get someone in Cheyenne to look at the water rights statutes and tell us exactly where we stand." She paused. "Do you know a lawyer?" "Not well." "Greer might. He knows everyone." Gideon looked at her. "You're not worried?" "I'm annoyed," she said. "There's a difference." She stood up and took her coffee to the window. "He's trying to create doubt where there isn't any. Men like Boggs run on the assumption that the people they're threatening either don't understand their own position or don't have the resources to defend it. We understand ours, and we'll get the resources. The legal fees could be—" "I know." She turned around. "But if we don't push back hard now, he'll try something else in 6 months that costs more. He's testing us." Gideon picked up the letter again. He looked at it for a moment, and she could see him working through it. Not the legality, he'd already done that, but the decision about how to respond. The kind of decision that's really a statement about what kind of man you're going to be about a thing. He folded the letter and stood up. "I'll ride to town and send a telegraph to a man I did business with in Laramie. He'll know someone in Cheyenne." "Good," she said. He was at the door when she said, "Gideon." He turned. "He picked the wrong ranch," she said. Something moved in his face, that almost smile, the one that lived just at the edge of his expression. "He did," he said. The lawyer they found was a woman, which Gideon had not expected, and Adeline had not specifically anticipated, but felt was, on reflection, entirely appropriate. Her name was Vera Hutchins, and she operated out of Cheyenne with a directness and an organized intelligence that Adeline recognized immediately as the particular competence of a woman who has had to be twice as good to be taken seriously and has therefore become so. She came up to Ash Ridge on a Tuesday in early March, arriving on the supply coach with a leather case in a manner that suggested she had no patience for people who confused formality with substance. She sat at Gideon's kitchen table, which was, Adeline reflected, where all the important conversations seemed to happen, and spread out the documents and read everything and asked sharp questions and got sharp answers, and then sat back and said, "The water rights are solid, filed correctly, witnessed by 2 county officials registered in the territorial records. There is no irregularity. What Boggs has done is pay someone to write a threatening letter using language designed to make a legitimate filing sound questionable." She tapped the letter with one finger. "This is a bluff. A sophisticated bluff. But a bluff. Can we demonstrate that clearly enough to make him stop?" Adeline said. "We can do better than that," Vera said. "We can respond formally, through my office, with a complete chain of title and a letter that makes clear that any further harassment of these water rights will result in a counterclaim for interference with property rights, and we will pursue it." She looked at Gideon. "Men like Boggs rely on targets that don't fight back. The moment you demonstrate that fighting back is exactly what you intend to do, and that you have the legal standing and the representation to do it credibly, most of them reassess." "Most of them," Gideon said. "Most," Vera confirmed. "A few are stubborn enough to push further. If he does, we'll be ready for that too." She looked at Adeline. "How did you find me, if you don't mind?" "I asked around until I found someone who'd won," Adeline said. Vera nodded once, the nod of a person who approves of methodology. "Then we understand each other." Yes. The response went out from Vera Hutchins' office in the second week of March. There was a silence of 11 days, which Adeline spent not thinking about it, or trying not to think about it, with the moderate success of a person who is aware of trying. She cooked and managed the house and helped with the early calving, which had begun in the last week of February, with the particular chaos that always attended it. The 2 early mornings and the cold, and the animals that needed help, and the ones that didn't, and the ongoing arithmetic of new life against a hard season. Jonah was in the thick of it. He'd been working the calving with Pete and Gideon since the first week, sleeping light the way ranchers do during calving season, up at any sound that might be a cow in difficulty. He'd lost one calf on a bad night and had come into the kitchen afterward with that expression she recognized, the one that said he understood loss as a fact of this work and was making himself accept it. And he'd drunk his coffee and not talked about it and gone back out. Pete had told her later that Jonah had done everything right, that the calf had simply come wrong and there was nothing more to be done, and that he'd told the boys so. "How'd he take it?" she'd asked. "Like a rancher," Pete said, which was the highest thing he knew how to say. Boggs's response came not as another legal letter, but as a withdrawal. Vera forwarded a terse communication from his Cheyenne lawyers, indicating that their client had reviewed the documentation and was satisfied that the water rights were in order and had no further questions. It was the language of a strategic retreat dressed up as the resolution of a misunderstanding, and everyone involved knew exactly what it was. Gideon read the letter and handed it to Adeline and said nothing. She read it and set it on the table. "He'll move on to something easier," she said. "Probably." "The Fenwick place?" "Maybe. Or he'll go back to Cheyenne and find another valley." He picked up his coffee. "Either way, he's done here." She thought about the homesteads he'd already taken, the Purdy's, possibly the Albertsons. Families who had needed the cash and not had the resources or the knowledge to understand what they were agreeing to. She thought about that for a moment, the unfairness of it, and then she put it in the place where she put things she couldn't fix right now and moved on. "Good," she said. It wasn't triumphant. Neither of them felt like being triumphant about it. They defended what was theirs and they were still standing, and that was the extent of it. Not a victory so much as the absence of a defeat, which in a Wyoming winter was sometimes the same thing. Spring came slowly, the way it always does at elevation, not a single arrival but a series of retreats and advances, the snow pulling back and then returning and pulling back further, the temperature climbing and dropping and climbing again. The mud season was brutal, every road a test of patience, the cattle restless and the pastures not yet ready for them. But the light was changing. By the end of March, the days had length to them again, and by April, there were mornings when the air coming through the kitchen window didn't cut. Maisie found a robin's nest in the elm beside the house and monitored it with a dedication that would have been impressive in an ornithologist. She reported on it at breakfast every morning, egg count, parental activity, any changes in construction, with the thoroughness of someone filing a daily dispatch. Gideon listened to these reports with more attention than he probably realized he was giving them. One morning she said, "There are 3 eggs now. And he said, without looking up from his coffee, "Was there a second adult bird yesterday?" And Maisie said, "Yes, bigger." And Gideon said, "Male. They come back when the nest is established." And Maisie said, "How do you know?" And he said, "I paid attention when I was young." And Maisie nodded and filed this away as further evidence that paying attention was a worthwhile activity, which was exactly the lesson, and he hadn't intended to teach it, and she had learned it anyway. This was the ordinary texture of the life they were building. Not extraordinary moments, mostly very ordinary ones. Breakfast conversations and evening arithmetic and the ongoing negotiation of a household with 4 people in it who all had opinions and not all of whom had learned when to express them and when to let it go. Gideon was still not easy to live with, which he told her in advance and which proved to be accurate. He kept hours that didn't always align with mealtimes. He could go an entire evening without saying anything that wasn't a direct answer to a direct question. He had a way of fixing something that was broken around the house. A door hinge, a sticking window, without announcing he was going to do it or that he had done it. So you'd come to a door that had been stiff for a week and find it swinging clean and have to decide whether to mention it or let it be. She let it be. She understood that this was how he said some things. She was not easy either. She knew that. She had opinions she stated without softening them, which Gideon had said he appreciated, and which occasionally, in practice, caused friction. She took on responsibilities without always consulting him, because she was used to making decisions alone and the habit died hard. She was better at forgiveness than she was at asking for it, which was something she was working on. These were the actual things. Not the clean version of 2 people fitting together like they'd always been designed to, but the real version. 2 people with their own histories and habits learning, slowly and imperfectly, to account for each other. There was an argument in April, a real one, about money. Specifically about the cost of repairing the Marsh property cabin versus the income it might generate from a tenant family, and whether it was worth the investment in the first year. She thought yes. He thought not yet. They went around it for 2 evenings and arrived at a compromise that neither of them had originally proposed, which was probably the right answer, and they didn't revisit it. The argument had been uncomfortable, and they'd both said things with more edge than necessary, and the resolution hadn't been elegant. But they'd gotten there. And the morning after, Gideon had come down to breakfast and poured his coffee and said, "The tenant plan might work if we limit the scope of the initial repairs." And she'd said, "That's what I suggested." And he'd said, "You suggested more than that." And she'd said, "I know, but the core of it was right." And he'd looked at her and said, "Yes, it was." And that was the end of it. That moment, unglamorous, practical, honest, was more real to her than anything that might have happened in a better story. This was what it meant to build something with another person, not the grand gestures, the ordinary willingness to come back the next morning. Pete Sully left in May. Not dramatically. Nothing about Pete was dramatic. His sister in Colorado had written asking him to come help her manage her late husband's small operation. And Pete, who had been a loyal man his entire working life, and was now in his mid-50s and had outlasted his own reasons for staying anywhere indefinitely, had decided it was time to go somewhere he was family, rather than somewhere he was employed. He told Gideon first because that was the right order of things. And Gideon received it with the stoic acceptance of a man who has learned that everything he values has the capacity to leave, and who has learned, more recently, that this is not a reason to refuse to value things. Pete told Jonah on his last morning in the barn, which was where Pete told Jonah most of the important things. "You know what you're doing out here now," Pete said. He was brushing down his horse, his own horse, the one he was taking, with the careful attention of a man who respects animals and always has. "Not everything. Nobody knows everything. But enough." Jonah was quiet for a moment. "It won't be the same," he said. "No," Pete said. "It won't. That's not a reason for anything." He stopped brushing and looked at the boy. This boy who had come to the ranch in December not knowing how to drive cattle and was now someone he would trust with the herd in a moderate crisis. "You know who taught me most of what I know?" "No. A man who left when I was 22. Went back to his family in Tennessee. I was angry about it for about a month." Pete went back to the brushing. "Then I realized I still had everything he'd taught me, and I understood it better once I was the one doing it without him." He paused. "That's how it works." Jonah nodded. He didn't look at Pete because he was 13 now, and 13-year-old boys do not show certain things to people they respect. Pete finished with the horse. He picked up his saddlebag. "Tell your mother she makes the best soup I've eaten in 20 years of ranch kitchens," he said. "Tell her yourself," Jonah said. "I'm going to. I'm telling you too, because you'll remember it after she forgets I said it." He went inside and said his goodbyes, and then he rode south, and the three of them stood on the porch and watched until the road bent and he was gone. Maisie said, "I'm going to miss him." "So am I," Gideon said. Adeline didn't say anything. She put her hand briefly on Jonah's shoulder and he let her, which at 13 was its own kind of statement. They hired 2 new hands in June, a brother and sister, improbably, named Frank and Dora Cassell, who had come up from New Mexico and were looking for steady work and had been referred by a rancher in the next valley. Dora was 24 and could rope as well as her brother and had no patience for men who doubted this, which Adeline recognized and respected immediately. Frank was 27, quiet and reliable in the manner of people who have learned that reliability is the most useful thing you can be. Ash Ridge had opinions about a woman working ranch hands' work because Ash Ridge had opinions about most things. The opinions were aired in the usual places, the saloon, the steps of the general store, and then, as the summer wore on and it became clear that the Hale Ranch was running better than it had in years, the opinions quietly revised themselves into the acceptance that frontier communities eventually extend to things that work. That was something Adeline had learned about this valley, about this town, about people in general. They talked, and then they watched. And if what they watched contradicted what they'd said, most of them, not all but most, updated accordingly. The talking never stopped, but the watching mattered more. Mrs. Greer, who had given Maisie cornbread on that first afternoon in December, and had perhaps understood something that day that the rest of the town was still catching up to, invited Adeline to the women's monthly gathering in July. Adeline went, and it was awkward for the first hour in the way that rooms are awkward when you are new to them and people are still deciding what you are. And then someone asked about the calving numbers from the spring, because everyone on the frontier is ultimately interested in calving numbers. And Adeline answered honestly and in detail, and after that, it was fine. She wasn't beloved in Ash Ridge. She didn't need to be. She was respected, which was more durable and considerably more useful. In August, Jonah turned 14. There was no party. Jonah had expressed clearly that he did not want to fuss, by which he meant he did not want to be looked at. But there was a dinner with the food he'd asked for, which was beef stew and biscuits and a dried apple pie. And after dinner, Gideon brought out a package wrapped in brown paper and set it on the table in front of him. Jonah looked at it and then at Gideon. "Open it," Gideon said. Inside was a pair of leather work gloves, good ones, proper rancher's gloves, not the cheap kind, and a pocket compass in a brass case, the kind that was useful for the kind of open country work Jonah was doing. Practical gifts, both of them. Things a working rancher needed. Jonah turned the compass over in his hands. He looked at Gideon. "Pete had one like this," he said. "I know," Gideon said. "He told me before he left." Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you," in the tone of a boy who means something larger than what the words carry. Gideon nodded once. "You've earned what you've earned out here," he said. "That's not a gift. That's a record." Adeline across the table looked at the two of them, this man and this boy who had found each other at the worst part of both their winters, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. Not a sentimental feeling. Quieter than that. More like the feeling of standing on ground that holds. Maisie ate 2 pieces of pie and announced that next year she wanted a party with guests. "You can have one," Gideon told her. "With cake," she said. "With cake," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and that was that. But there is a thing people say about frontier life, that it either breaks you or makes you, as though those are the only 2 outcomes, as though the question is simply whether you survive or you don't. Adeline had heard this said many times and had nodded when people said it because they meant well, but she had never fully believed it was that simple. What the frontier actually did, in her experience, was ask you a question, over and over in different forms with different levels of urgency, a question about what you were willing to do to keep going, not to triumph, just to keep going. And the answer you gave day after day was who you were. Not who you'd planned to be or who you wished you were, but who you actually were, assembled from the choices you made when there was no good option, only the least bad one. She thought about this sometimes in the early mornings, before the house was up, standing at the kitchen window with her first coffee of the day, looking out at the valley and whatever light was available. She thought about February and the $31 and the wagon that had brought her into a town that stared at her. She thought about Gideon opening the door of this house with the expression of a man confronting something he hadn't expected. She thought about Jonah in the barn in the blizzard, and Maisie on the floor with the photograph, and Pete's hand on the back of Jonah's neck on the worst night. None of it had been clean. None of it had been the way she would have written it if she'd been writing it. There had been grief in it that didn't resolve. She still thought about her husband, about who he'd been before the illness, about the farm in Nebraska that was someone else's farm now. Those things didn't go away. They just became part of the territory you lived in rather than the emergency you were in. And there was this, a house where people ate together and argued and repaired things and fed cattle and grew a little every season, even when growing was uncomfortable. There was Gideon, who was difficult and honest and had decided at the age of 39 that being alone was not the same as being safe. There was Jonah, who carried a compass in his pocket now and knew what to do in a storm. There was Maisie, who had never been afraid of this place, who had looked at it from the first and decided it was hers. The photograph of Clara still sat on the mantel in the parlor. Adeline had moved it once, not to remove it, just to clean under it, and had set it back exactly where it was. There were mornings when she looked at it and felt the weight of the young woman in it, the life that had been in this house before her, and she let herself feel that rather than pushing past it, that woman had built something here, had loved someone here, had left a space that had stayed empty for 4 years until a supply wagon dropped a widow at the edge of town with $31 and nowhere particular to be. You could call that a lot of things. Adeline called it what it was, a life, moving forward, carrying everything it had ever been. By the time the first frost of the following October touched the valley, earlier than last year, the ranchers said, reading the signs they'd learned to read, the hail operation ran from the main house east to the marsh property and north to the water rights that Harlan Boggs had tried and failed to shake loose. The cattle were in good condition going into winter, the hay stores were solid, the calving numbers from the spring had been the best in 5 years. Dora Castle had become indispensable in the way that competent people always do, and Frank had taken on Pete's old role with a quiet authority that felt less like replacing Pete than like a continuation of what Pete had built. Jonah was working the herd with the ease of someone who has been doing this long enough that it's become instinct, and he'd started teaching Maisie things, not letting her do dangerous work, but explaining, the way Pete had explained to him, sideways and unremarkable. One evening in October, Gideon came in from the northern pasture and stood at the kitchen window, the way he sometimes did, looking at the early dark and the frost on the glass, and Adeline, at the stove, said without turning around, "How are they?" "Good," he said. "Better than last year going in." "The north shelter held through summer?" "Solid." He poured coffee. He stood with it. "We should add to it before February." "I know. I was looking at the lumber costs last week." She turned around. "It's manageable if we do it in November before the ground freezes hard." He nodded. He looked at her across the kitchen. This woman who had come to his door in a coat that was barely sufficient for the weather and had stood in the cold and offered him work rather than asking for mercy. And there was something in his face that was not the almost smile, not the assessing look, not the complicated stillness she'd spent the winter learning to read. It was something simpler than those, something he hadn't had to perform. "You're thinking about something," she said. "I'm thinking you should have asked for more than $14 a month." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that happens when you're not expecting it. "You couldn't have afforded what I was worth." "Probably not," he said. He didn't say it as a joke. He said it as a fact, which made it land differently. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the frost was settling into the grass, the valley going silver in the early dark. In 2 months, the snow would come, and the cattle would push to the windbreaks, and the work would ask everything again. It always did. That was the nature of this place, this life, this particular arrangement of people and land and season. But the soup pot was on the stove, and the wood box was full, And somewhere upstairs, Maisie was monitoring the progress of a drawing she was making of the barn. And Jonah was doing the feed calculations that Gideon had asked him to run. Asked him, not Pete or Frank, him. And the house was full of the particular sounds of a place that is being lived in by people who have decided to stay. That was the thing, in the end. The decision to stay. Not because there was nowhere else to go. Adeline had learned that there was always somewhere else to go, that moving was always possible, that a person could spend their entire life in motion and call it living. But to stop. To say, here. This difficult, imperfect, cold, and demanding here. To say it not as a defeat or a settling for, but as a choice. A clear-eyed, fully informed, take it as it is choice. That was what home actually was, she thought. Not a place that was easy, a place you kept choosing. She chose it every morning when she woke before light. She chose it in the soup that was always on the stove. She chose it in the accounts she kept and the arguments she had, and the mending she did by the fire and the way she sometimes put her hand briefly on Jonah's shoulder and he let her. The frost deepened outside. The kitchen was warm. In Ash Ridge, the barometer was steady. The winter was coming and they were ready.